Alright, guys, welcome back to the podcast here at Theory and Theology. It's gonna be a quick one this morning because I'm busy. We're recording right before work. Today marks the winter solstice of 2022. I almost forgot what year it was. So let's see. So some studying that I got through last night, I would say the first 4 books of First Maccabees, I was listening to an audio recording thinking, okay, like it's a little after 9:30 or so. I'll put this on and maybe get tired and want to go to sleep. It is not a very good bedtime story. I haven't gone through the story of Hanukkah or the revolt of the Maccabees in a very long time. But I'm not going to explain the entire story. What I can do is post the audio recording from YouTube that I was hearing. It's chapter by chapter of the New Revised Standard Version, Apocrypha. It has First Maccabees, and there's also one for Second Maccabees, the whole entire books of both. But that's where you find the Hanukkah story. Somebody mentioned that, in something I was reading some just online blogs, articles and stuff. Somebody mentioned that that Hanukkah wasn't called Hanukkah, like that term is more related to dedication. So some things I wanted to talk about were this winter solstice and paganism and Judaism and Hanukkah and Christianity and Jesus interacting with Hanukkah. It's very fascinating stuff. I didn't really naturally at first hand see any kind of overlapping, but when I was listening to the Hanukkah story, because I've been studying a little bit about paganism, I started thinking about it, and I'm not really here to take sides or whatever, but biblical stories, apocryphal stories, the majority is kind of written from the side of a Jewish perspective, right? So anyone who comes in who's starting wars is always against the Jews, and then God saves the Jews, from these different, war times. And so some interesting things I learned. Excuse me. So the initial war that took place, I don't know why it took place, and I'm not 100% sure if it was Greek people. It seems like it was Greek people who came into Jerusalem who were fighting with the Jews in Jerusalem. For what reason, I don't really know. I might have to go back and look and see if there was a reason mentioned. But basically, the Jewish people got conquered. And so it's not uncommon in history that when one group conquers another group of people, they come in with their own ideals, religions, ways of doing things. They're not very respectful. I mean, if you think about when the U.S. invaded Iraq, I mean, I'm not trying to get political here, but think about when the U.S. invaded Iraq. There was a lot of um, ancient and important historical, monuments and things that were destroyed by the war. The Americans weren't like trying to like reserve, you know, Babylonian history or anything. They were just like, okay, this is war. We're going in and we're doing what we're doing. It's like that in every war. Like nobody's there like, oh, like don't destroy this because this is like an important historical thing, or don't destroy this because this is an important thing for these people's culture and religion. Nobody does that. Unfortunately, people just couldn't care less. So they come in with their own beliefs, their own. Nowadays, it's more so political systems. It's like, okay, we want other people to have our political system because it benefits us, right? If other people are doing other things, we can't really trade properly. It doesn't help our economy any. If they're doing something different than how we're doing it, there's really not going to be the proper communication and ability to kind of make like any kind of like efforts. It's all financial, right? Um, but a lot of wars too can be religious. So this was more of a war that had, at least the focus seems to be on the religious aspect of the Jewish sacred places were being taken over by the Greek people during a war, right? So it was a war, and the Jewish people lost this war, the first one, and then basically I believe it was a pagan ritual, which is why the pigs were sacrificed, and then they basically forced the Jews to stop doing their commandments, their Sabbath, their circumcision, like a lot of things that were custom. And then there were wars and wars and wars. Now, in my head, I was always thinking, okay, like, there was a battle, and then all of a sudden, the Maccabees revolted and won, and, I was thinking it was like a quick turnover. And it seems like this lasted for like a long time. It was like 20 something years. It was like 20 something years before the temple got restored, before the Jewish culture was able to get restored, to be able to do their practices again. And so they were under rule of other people. There was like all these wars going on. That wasn't the only war. There were Persians who came in after that sometime. I don't remember, but I mean, I'm trying to like fall asleep listening to this story, and there's just all these battles going on for like 4 whole chapters, and to the point where the Maccabees decided, like, something I found interesting, we're just gonna go through and circumcise all the young boys, and do our Jewish things. And it was just very interesting trying to take a different not really like, okay, I agree or disagree with any perspective, but trying to take a different perspective on it and be like, okay, like, yeah, it's war, so ugly things are gonna happen. People aren't really at their best character. They're not like being polite and humble. They're killing and doing terrible things. And so that was the first thing that came up for me, where I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is a lot, but that's kind of what the purpose of the story is about. But it was a whole lot of time, over 20 years of wars and things before the Jews could go back to living how they kind of wanted to live, because a lot of the culture got wiped out because they weren't allowed to practice it basically for like a couple decades, almost 3 decades. And so there's that. So like that pagan perspective of like, okay, this is a war and we're coming in and we're gonna do our rituals and start doing our things and make the Jewish culture do our things. And then the Jewish people were like, well, we keep getting killed when we keep trying to do the Jewish ways. They just keep killing us. And so eventually they kind of had to do it the way that they didn't want to do it. And then if you look in John chapter 10, you see, so I know before I talked about the holiday of Sukkot, in the New Testament Bible, they call it the Feast of Booths, or Festival of Booths, like a booth, like, like if you go to a fair and there's like a booth, like that. It just sounds weird saying, like, I don't really use that word too much, but that was a couple months back, and then that was a few chapters before, in like around chapter 7 or something, I don't remember. And then you go to John chapter 10 and you see Jesus at the Festival of Lights, or the Festival of Dedication, or the Feast of Dedication, or whatever it's called in there, representing Hanukkah, walking in Solomon's colonnade or portico or whatever it's called in whatever version you pick up. And he's walking around and a group comes around him and he starts talking about, I don't know what the question was or what prompted him to start talking about being the Son of God. And then he quotes something saying that, it looked like it was something from Psalms like 80 something, Psalms 82, from what it seemed like. Psalms 82, like 6 and 7 or something like that, talking about, there's like a part of the passage that said like Psalm of Asaph, and then it says, that's the section, and then it says something about you are gods or something like that. Like, I don't really know the context of that text, and I don't know if that's what Jesus was referring to, because he said, he's basically saying, like, just on the surface of what he's saying, I don't know if there's more depth to this, but he was saying, like, you are gods, like, your law says you are God, so why are you kind of mad that I'm saying I'm the Son of God? And of course they're trying to like kill him or stone him, and then they try to arrest him and he escaped and then gets in a boat and goes, somewhere else again. But I'm just like, I don't know, Jesus is always an interesting person, that he is, in these arguments with people. And myself, I find it difficult to understand the quotes that he uses in the Old Testament, because he quotes things and it's just like, it seems like the most obscure things. Like, if he really was quoting from Psalms, from some passage that says something about Psalm of Asaph, and when I read that, passage, even before those verses and stuff, I don't really understand the full connection. So that's something that I kind of get a little like, I don't really know anybody who really takes that approach to look at the quotes that Jesus says about like the law or the prophets or whatever, and the quotes he uses in his arguments against others. Like, the ones that I did understand maybe a little bit, not really, not the context, but were after Jesus gets baptized and he goes wandering in the wilderness, in the desert, and then Satan comes to try to tempt him, and those quotes that he uses against Satan, those were ones that I kind of maybe I understood it because in churches I've learned about it more, but I was starting to notice that yesterday. I was like, whenever I read quotes that Jesus said some kind of rebuttal against, people trying to stone him or arrest him or kill him or charge him, and then also just thinking about that cultural approach. It's like, okay, these people are following him around. Oh yeah, and that's what they were saying. They're like, aren't you gonna do something? Like, why aren't you like, showing yourself? Like, aren't you gonna like do something? And maybe it was because of the time period. Maybe it was because of it being Hanukkah, and because Hanukkah was a time when the Maccabees re-commemorated their temple. So maybe since Jesus was over there, they assumed he was gonna re-commemorate their temple, or do something spectacular at that moment. But this is like right before the death of Lazarus, and so it's just, I don't know. There's just a lot. There's a lot more to unpack than I have time to do before work. But it's fascinating. It's just fascinating to me. It's also fascinating to me that, when you are raised as Christian, as much as you're taught to read the Bible and hear the Bible and stuff, Hanukkah comes around. You might even be in a church during Hanukkah time, and nobody's usually really talking about the story of Hanukkah. Nobody's talking even about Jesus and what he was doing during Hanukkah. It's just like erased, and I do kind of see that theme in Christianity of the Judaism getting erased out of the history, which is odd to me, because if you read the Bible from a pagan perspective, and most of us weren't really raised like in a pagan traditional household, unless you're like some kind of like European person. Usually you weren't raised in like paganism, so it's just interesting. It's all interesting to me, but I gotta get logged in and get on with my day. But that's kind of it for this morning. I'm still a bit mind boggled over last night what I was reading, so I don't know if I'm ever gonna figure it out. Some of these things take like years to find like any kind of little nugget, and I'm not gonna be studying this stuff like all day, all night. It was just a quick little thing, just because it's the time period. I do like to kind of learn, and because I was like, okay, like today's gonna be the winter solstice. It's December 21st, so I don't have any real connections, but of anything that kind of made sense to me. There's nothing I could like tie together all together, but it was just pieces of those different, 3 different cultures that come up around this time of year. That's just interesting that they're still in society. When you look around, like nobody's talking about the other ones. Like nobody's talking about any of the other things going on, as if they almost don't exist. And so it's kind of fun for me to have my toe kind of dipped in multiple cultural kind of relevant things happening at this current time. So it's interesting to be like, oh, it's Hanukkah, and it's the winter solstice, and Sunday is going to be Christmas, and reading about Jesus during Hanukkah time. And it's just like interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it, because usually it's like people are like, just like pick one and just only do that, and just like ignore everything else, right? But I don't know, that doesn't interest me. But that method of thinking doesn't interest me. But alright, I gotta get going. But for now, thanks for listening.